Thank you, Andy, for reading that. And that particular version is from the New Revised Standard edition of the Bible, and it brings some subtle differences to the NIV that are maybe worth exploring, that I'll maybe touch on a little bit. But what I love about this Psalm 51 is it's almost like a really compacted version of the whole message of the Bible. It doesn't explicitly contain Jesus and what Jesus has done that we'll be celebrating later, and yet it's got all of the components of the whole Bible compressed down just into one song and one psalm. And that's what I love about it. It paints a beautiful picture of somebody who's really close to God's heart, who actually has a really deep understanding of who God is. And yet he's aware of his transgressions, he's aware of his separation, and yet he's eagerly seeking renewal with God. And I don't know where you are at this morning, but I'm sure that at parts of your life so far, that there are moments where you can really echo David's heart's cry. There have been times and places where you've really felt broken and far away from God. And yet we can look, as we look at this psalm, and really grow and experience and see how, with this psalm, we can stand on a holy place and find renewal and healing. And often that place of being brokenness can really affect our mental well-being, and that's kind of the series that we're looking at the moment, is mental well-being. And we maybe have been carrying hurts, pain, sorrow from a long time away, a long time that we carry it, and yet we can find within this psalm a place of holiness, a place of healing, and we're going to be looking at that today. But I wondered, before we start, we often use this word sin, and I wondered if you needed to explain what sin is to somebody, how would you explain it? I wonder what words you might think or try to use. In the Old Testament, you can see here on the screens, it uses different words because actually it's a really quite complicated or complex kind of scenario. Some of the words that are used in the Old Testament have their root in kind of missing the mark. You know, having a standard that we kind of missed, or maybe going down a wrong path. That's another sort of root to some of the words as well. Some of the other ones is, straying from the correct path, or perversion of truth, being kind of that lying, deliberate perversion or twisting of truth. And another one is rebellion of God as well. They use that a lot. In the new part of the Testament, the Apostle Paul says in his big book Romans that we studied collectively together that anything that does not come from faith is sin. And I had somebody say to me a while ago that turning away from the love of God, that's what sin is. But I wonder, how would you describe sin? And I think that some of these really touch on it. And the one that I'd like to frame and be able to explore and think about, particularly today, is this idea of sin as being where our hearts are seeking fullness outside of the love of God. Where our hearts are seeking fullness outside of the love of God. This is what Jesus picks up when he's talking. Because when he's talking, the Jewish people at the time had lots of rules about what could be eaten, what couldn't be eaten, what will make you unclean or not unclean. And Jesus speaks straight through that in Mark 7. And he says, it's not what you're eating that makes you unclean, but it's where your heart, it's what's coming out from you that is unclean. Also, when the young man comes and speaks to him and says, what are the greatest commandments? Jesus says, it's to love God with your whole heart and to love other people as yourself. The other bits, the other commandments are really just expressions out of how do we keep these two things pure and core. There's possible also to, when we look at other sins like the 7 deadly sins or whatever, that the root of that is often where our hearts are seeking fullness outside of the love of God. But that's not where we were created to be, though, is it? And we know that from Genesis and from the other account. When God created Adam and Eve, and that first couple of chapters, what a beautiful picture of what we as a human race should be like. And what God had created us. He's made us wonderful people. He's made us in his own image. He's made us to be able to walk and delight in his presence through our journey of our day, in continual dialogue with him. And what a beautiful, intimate relationship that seems to be. And that's who we've been created to be. But our hearts have got shifted. Sometimes through our own things, sometimes stuff that other people have done have actually wounded our hearts and made our hearts and how we react to situations complicated and difficult. It's not that what I'm not saying is that the actions aren't important. The actions and our sin, what we do, is important. But it's like the waves on the sea. The waves can be really big sometimes, and they can be little sometimes. But actually, they're just the outcoming of actually what's happening between the wind of life that's blowing around and the currents of the sea. And what we're saying here is that outwards of our sin and actions are just a reflection of what's happening in life and where our hearts are, and the separation of our hearts and our longing for the fullness of God. So we're going to explore David's psalm, and we're going to look a bit more about this. But just on the slide at the moment, it's a picture. I was recently given a copy of a book called The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse. And it is a beautiful book. I'm sure many of you have already got copies, and if you haven't, I recommend them. And it's just drawings, and there's a lot of Christian wisdom held within them. But one of the pictures that I like is this one. And I can't quite read it from that screen, so I'll read it from here. But it's the mole really loves cake, just as you need to know that. But the story goes, this boy says, "I've realised why we are here," whispered the boy. "Is it cake?" said the mole, hopefully. "It is to love," said the boy. And then the horse also says, "and to be loved." And I think that there's a lot for us, and we could have a whole sermon on that, I'm sure. But what a great thing and a picture of why we're here. But let's explore this great Psalm of David and see where we can seek forgiveness and renewal in this psalm. And there are a few things that are great about David and this psalm. And the first thing, for me, that came up to me, and I hope these things are useful for you too, and I just offer them out to you, is that he starts with a really deep understanding of who God is and the character of God. He starts right from verse 1, "Have mercy on me, O God, according to your steadfast love, according to your abundant mercy." He comes into this situation where he's been made aware of some sin that he's committed, and some things that he's hurt, including the death of somebody, and adultery. But in it, he comes to this place actually from a deep understanding of God's love and God's mercy. And I'm sure that was formed not there in the moment, but probably in the many years that he had beforehand, probably just as a shepherd, in the hills, singing the songs, from the different life decisions that he's made, and his journey has allowed him to have a really deep and rich understanding of God's mercy and God's grace, which is why he's able to come to God, even though he's known that he's committed some, really bad things. And we can really learn about that. How well are we learning about the character of God? And we're also able to have the benefit of the Bible and the New Testament, and some of the stories that Jesus gives us give us a really clear picture of helping us know what God is like and who God is. Jesus gives us the story of the prodigal son, and Simon talked on that a while ago. A really good way of helping us understand the character of God. Or if we're still wanting to develop more about understanding the character of God, even just pick up a gospel and read the John's gospel or even Mark's gospel, and just look at how Jesus interacts with the different people that he meets. especially those that are actually seeking him and seeking renewal. And you'll see more about the character of God. There's also a book that I would recommend called What's So Amazing About Grace. It's a great classic of a book. I'm sure many of you have read it. Maybe reread it again. But it's a really good book that just helps us understand in modern situations what the character of God is like. So that's the first thing that we can learn from David. And here's another picture, which, if you know me, that you'll know that at the moment this is one of my favourite pictures by the same author, same artist. And this is a picture that's actually called The Prodigal Daughter. And we're going to be having that up on the screen later on. But for me, that expresses and touches my heart about where the character of God is as well. But the second thing, what's the second thing that we can learn from here? And that's from verse 3. He says, I know my transgressions and my sin is before me. He doesn't hide. He doesn't give excuses as to why he did what he did. He doesn't try to blame other people for why he acted in the way that he did. He just comes before God and says, yes, I know that I've done wrong. It reminds me of Adam and Eve in the garden. When they sinned, what did Adam do when God confronted him about it? He quickly tried to slip the blame onto somebody else. And so here we have a difference, and what I believe is the right way of being able to face God with our brokenness and with the sin, and that's just being able to be upfront. You can be upfront with God and be angry. God can hold you in your anger. Sometimes when Emma was a younger child, and she would sometimes get really, really angry, and I was able to just wrap my arms around her and just hold her in her anger. And sometimes we need to be able to do that with God and allow God to just hold us where we're at. I've often found at times that we need God's Spirit to work in our own hearts to help us understand why, what the causes are for our heart and what the causes are for our sin. Sometimes, somebody said once, the heart can be deceptive. And sometimes when we are trying to understand our motivations for things, it can feel quite deceptive. You know, what's really going on? And actually we need God's Spirit at work in our hearts to illuminate us. Illuminate what's really going on beneath the surface of the actions and the things that are going on. Sometimes it can also be helpful to have somebody else to speak to you about stuff. You know, Jen and I, just this last week, there have been a couple of times where we've been able to talk stuff through, and Jen's been able to point out and help me realize what's actually going on beneath the surface. And that's just another way of God speaking to me through somebody else. And whether that's a deep friend or, trusted somebody else, it doesn't have to be, a spouse or anything. It can just be those good friends that we know and have. And that's the joy of some of that friendship, isn't it? Is knowing that we've got people that can speak truth and help us untangle some of what's going on. The third thing is that David seeks renewal. Yes, but he seeks renewal in God's presence. He says in verse 10, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and put a new and right spirit within me. Do not cast me away from your presence, and do not take your Holy Spirit from me." Again, when we think a bit of Adam and Eve, when they realized that they had sinned, and they heard God walking through the garden, what did they do? They hid. And yet David here is saying, I'm here, God. I don't want to be out of your presence. I'm aware sometimes when I feel distant from God, when maybe my heart is drawn away from him, and I can actually even sometimes sense him calling me back to him. And yet I maybe find distractions. Maybe I find that other Netflix video set that was somehow a bit more attractive than what it maybe should have been. Maybe I watch Twitch instead, which is watching people play computer games. Or it might be just other things that you find as a distraction from that. And that's me hiding from where I'm at and not wanting to come to God. But here, David just brings it clearly. And also, David seeking that renewal. He's not focusing necessarily on the actions that he did, although that's important. What he's seeking is the renewal of our hearts, so that his heart becomes more who God has created him to be. And he's seeking that renewal. Sometimes people have found in life that God does that in a really dramatic and quick way. But often I've found that that's actually quite a subtle and delicate process that takes a really long time. Sometimes God can heal aspects of our brokenness, but over long time. And Dan spoke a bit about that last week. Sometimes we can process that on our own. And God meets us maybe in a quiet place or something like that, and that's great. But sometimes we may need help. And so it's great to be able to talk to other people, to process stuff, to seek renewal. Sometimes it might be get in contact with Katie or the church pastoral team, and they can help. Sometimes it might be starting to think through whether spiritual direction or maybe some counselling can help, because sometimes these are delicate things, and sometimes it needs people that have a deeper sense of wisdom to help guide us through some of these things, to allow our hearts to be renewed. Because, like David, I am really convinced that this is the work of God and the work of Spirit in our lives, that he hungers and longs for us to come to be in his presence in our brokenness, and to allow him to bring healing, and that we can experience and know healing and God with us through our journey of life with him. It may be difficult at times. It may be really painful at times. But people can be with you and journey with you through it. And God is with you and will hold you and be with you through it too. And I just want to especially say this is true for people that are still holding maybe guilt or shame from maybe choices that they've made in the past, that actually there can be freedom from that, knowing the forgiveness of God through maybe the things that we've done, and the renewal of that too. And then finally, the last thing. Sorry, back to the horse and the boy. I forgot this. And this is just the horse going along. And the boy asks the horse, "What is the bravest thing you've ever done?" And the horse says, "I said help," said the horse. And then 2 pages on, you get this wonderful saying as well, which is, asking for help is not giving up, said the horse. It's refusing to give up. Sometimes we may think that asking for help is giving up, but actually when we're asking for help, we're refusing to let this thing continue to control and be part of our lives, and we're seeking help. We're refusing to give up and seek God through it. But fourthly, and fairly quickly, we're now exploring towards the end of the psalm. And it's verse 13 where David says, restore me and sustain in me a willing spirit. Then I will teach your ways, and sinners will return to you. Open my lips, and my mouth will declare your praise. Here we hear from David that that it's not the work of God he will not keep hidden or keep secret, but he will use it to enable other people to understand the goodness and the grace of God. We also see here that the sin that he had and that resulted in somebody's death, and I'm sure probably more people, and that didn't disqualify him from further works of God in his life. It's not the end of the story. It is but a page, and there are many pages still to come. He will use what's happened to him. That's not to say that it was a good thing, of course not. As Paul says in Romans again, should we continue sinning so that grace abounds? Absolutely not. It was not a good thing. But through it, God's grace can be made aware in more and more people's lives as they experience and they can see what God has done. So any hurt that we might have caused other people does not disqualify us. The consequences of David's sin, for those that don't know the story, did not go away. There were consequences to this that caused a lot of pain going forward and broke up some of his family. And for some of us, in our situations, there are consequences to our sin. Now, God graciously sometimes takes those away. We pray undeservedly. Sometimes the consequences of what we've done wrong don't quite manifest in the way they should. But sometimes they do. There's something in our lives, there's something in my life that had big consequences for us. And sometimes that can be really hard, not only because it might be a consequence to you, but it might be a consequence to the other people that you love that have to journey and process stuff. And that can be really difficult, but that doesn't disqualify us from God's love. It doesn't disqualify us from being used powerfully and wonderfully by God going forward. It doesn't disqualify us from experiencing our hearts in union with him, our hearts melting with his heart of the infinite love of God. Jesus gives us an example of what a life fully in relationship with God looks like. And what a beautiful picture of what humankind should be and what we are called to be and what God's grace in us will bring about. And as I say, we've not explored in this psalm, David doesn't explore in this particular psalm the work of Jesus. But yet through it we can see that actually it's through the life and the living and the death and the resurrection of Jesus that we too share in the unity of God, that we can have his Holy Spirit at work in us, enabling us and transforming us and enabling us to be renewed through his presence. God does not require us to already be good before we're in his presence because of the work and the life of Jesus. And that's why we can have joy of our salvation and hope and faith in what our life and our journey with God will be in the future.